All right, well, welcome back. I'm Rod Arders, Director of Student Ministries at Huntersville United Methodist Church, and with me is
David Washco, the Director of Discipleship at Denver United Methodist Church. So, Rod, it's good to be back for part two of our podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to say good to see you yesterday, but as you know, it was earlier, just a few minutes ago.
Well, I think my same shirt is giving it away.
We don't change clothes, but we hope that you watched the podcast from yesterday. If you didn't, it's online and it's available to you. But today we're talking about Acts chapter 17. We're picking it up at verse 16 to 32, and we're finding that Paul actually goes ahead and he's in a town called Athens. Have you heard of Athens?
I think I have heard of Athens, but I have a feeling it's not the same Athens that we can think about and what we can witness to. But I'm real curious, Rod, what jumped out at you with regards to this interaction right here?
Yeah, so I've traveled to Europe. I've been in many different countries, and you know, whenever you go, even on mission trips, I've been on some of these places, and you kind of go to these places, like London. I'll just pick on London. When I was in London, I was really enthralled that, it's London and all the history, and you got Shakespeare, and you got Westminster Abbey and Buckingham Palace, and you can kind of get lost in the, wow, where am I? And this is so cool. And Athens would be that kind of city. It was an amazing city. I mean, it's amazing to us, but even at Paul's time, it was a massively well-known city with an amazing history. And here's the Apostle Paul showing up in Athens, and he's not impressed that we can see in the scriptures. He's not impressed with the history. He's not impressed with the buildings, the architecture. He's actually, we're told, he's greatly distressed by the idols, the idolatry that he sees. And I think that's really says a lot about his character. I would go and be enthralled with the history, and he's like, man, he's disgusted by the idolatry that he sees.
Yeah, so he's not being taken off mission at all.
No, he's not. He's not. That's a great way to say it.
So with this, what transpires right here?
So, we find him again reasoning in the synagogue. I mean, he's going to go back, as was his custom. That's what we learned yesterday. As was his custom, he's going to go right back to the synagogues, which is where the Jews and the Greeks are, and he's going to start talking with them again about the gospel and about Jesus. So,
yeah, and this is kind of, Paul's got this salesmanship side of him, and what he does is he builds familiarity with his audience, right? And he was repeating back to them what's going on in their culture. He almost comes across as if he is one of them, which clearly he's not. But they're hearing him talking about everything that's going on in their culture, so he's building credibility with them.
Yeah, he absolutely is. And you know, Paul, we know, is a very smart person. He's an intellectual of sorts, and he's in the city of intellectuals. So he's not outmatched here by any means. He's in a different culture, but he sizes up pretty quickly. I think he's a guy that walks in and he sizes up very quickly, kind of like a lawyer would. I'm gonna figure out who these people are. And we see he comes across a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and they begin to debate him. And I think Paul, in that moment, is like, yes, this is why I came to Athens.
The doors are open.
Yeah.
So he goes through listing out and discussing about what's going on in their culture, but then he narrows in on this one scenario, which is an unknown God.
Unknown God, yeah. And I think it's really interesting because this would be a city filled with idols. I mean, everywhere. In fact, the Greek word, when it says full of idols, it literally means swamped with. It's like swamped with idols. So I don't know if we can even appreciate what that might. Maybe like India would be our closest understanding of a country that has just idols everywhere, or little mini gods. And so he addresses them. He stands up in the middle of this meeting and he says, "People of Athens, I see that you are in every way religious." So how could he not? He's looking around and seeing all these idols, and he's kind of identifying with them and saying, "Look, I see you're religious. I come from a religious background," so he would get it. He would understand it. And then he points to this inscription to an unknown God, and I think he uses that. That would be very common to them, and I think he uses that as a bridge to say, "I'm going to get your attention," because he's speaking about something very personal and local to them. So
yeah, and this unknown God is exactly that, unknown, yet they're worshiping to him. And so Paul just dives in and takes advantage and says, let me tell you about this unknown God and the proper way to worship. That's what the relationship really looks like.
Yeah, because it's not unknown to Paul. I mean, it's unknown to them, but Paul is saying, I'm going to fill in the blank. You have it said it's unknown. I'm going to give you the name or reveal the knownness of this God. So I think it's really interesting.
Anything else in this scripture jump out for you?
You know, it is interesting is that he talks about this unknown God, and he's kind of building that bridge. Like, yeah, I see the religious, I see all this. And then he says, you're ignorant of the very thing you worship, which is really not. I mean, he clearly didn't read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. He's going for the jugular. But that's like what you said with Paul, maybe it was in the last podcast. He's the Babe Ruth of the apostles. He's going to swing and get a home run, or he's going to swing and strike out, but he's going for it.
Yeah, and obviously these people don't take offense when he calls them ignorant. They understand that it doesn't mean stupid. Yeah. It means lack of knowledge. Yeah. And he's there and he's giving them more knowledge. And so when he does that, how do they respond? What do they want from him?
Well, I mean, they at the end, the very last thing says, we want to hear from you again. We want to hear more about this subject, which I think shares a humility of sorts, that they're interested. So.
Yeah, and I think, again, because he starts with the basis of reasoning, he starts with the basis of acknowledging their culture. Yeah. There's a lot of affirmation going on. He doesn't just go right in and go for the jugular, right, and tell them they're wrong.
That's
Let
right.
me tell you how it is.
That's right.
So I think, again, like we talked in the last podcast, we need to, as our application maybe from this scripture is, maybe step back and take a look at how we approach sharing the gospel, or how we approach reading the gospel. Are we reading it with grace, or are we reading it as a rule-based, right? Is it behavior modification? Yeah. And because Paul's definitely coming at it from a point of grace.
Yeah, and I think Paul would certainly have to, because he at one point was them in a different culture, but he thought he knew God, and his God was unknown to him. You know, he was an intellectual, and as we know, he talks about in scriptures how he had the pedigree and the credibility and all the initials after his name, but it didn't do any good because he didn't actually know the God that he was supposed to be preaching about. So,
yeah, and I think Paul is an awesome and visual example of God is pursuing you, right? Our God, the creator of everything. Hard to believe that he's not sitting there waiting. Yeah. He's literally pursuing us, wanting an intimate relationship with us. And you can see Paul is mimicking that in his lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, and I think for all of us too, we all have people that we wish would come to church. We wish that they would know Christ the way we know him. And I think sometimes our methods aren't very effective. You know, we want to give the sermon, we want to preach at them. And I think we forget, hey, that's not necessarily what reached us, you know. I know for me, you know, and some of you guys know my story, but I was a punk 13-year-old kid playing basketball at a church parking lot basketball net. And every week I was out there shooting hoops. And one Wednesday night, the church had a prayer meeting, and all these cars were parked right underneath my net. And I was really annoyed by that because I wanted to play basketball, and they had this little prayer meeting going on. And so I found a way to shoot hoops, but it was a very narrow court that I had that night. And a guy would come out named Bob Smith, and he would, dressed in a suit, and I knew he was from the church. And he didn't say, don't play. He didn't preach at me. He just built that relationship. And I just remember thinking how nice he was and how kind he was. And through that relationship, that was one of the ways that God used that to get me into church. And because he bridged the gap. You know, he didn't come at me like I thought he might as this punk 13-year-old.
So he didn't focus on those side view mirrors.
He didn't, up. Yeah, and I tried not to, but yeah, that's right.
Well, I want to also point out, because I think it's real important, we touched a little bit on it in the last podcast, but it's a consistent theme. And Paul recognizes that his impact is going to result in three ways: either rejection, reflection, or reception. Yeah. And this is one of those scenarios where we get to read about where there's a lot of reception.
Yeah, that's a great way really great way to look at it. And I think that's probably true for all of us. You know, we have one of those three responses to what we see in the gospel. And in this case, we see the reception. They're saying, hey, we want to hear again on this subject. And I think that's a win. I don't think the goal is you got to bring someone from the 5-yard line to the goal line. Maybe our job is to bring them from the 5-yard line to the 10-yard line. And
that's something real important. I'm glad you brought that up. We're not promised to see the outcome, right? Some of us are planting seeds. Sometimes we get to be blessed and see the watering.
That's right.
Some of us get to see the fruit.
That's
you
right.
know, when you get to see the whole process, that's an awesome blessing. But we can't get down on ourselves if we don't watch the whole process.
That's right.
Sometimes God's just using us to be that initial touch.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So for you out there, what's your job today? What is God asking you to do in regards to reasoning with the scriptures with people in your life? It's not about preaching at them. It's not about throwing stones. It's about saying, hey, let's dialogue. Let's talk about, you have a belief in this unknown God. Let's talk about that, what that looks like, and see what can develop. So,
yeah, and I just, since we mentioned it, I just want you to realize God is pursuing you. Not just special people. He's pursuing all his children. He wants an intimate relationship with everyone. So my question would be, do you consider yourself having an intimate relationship with God?
That's good. Good challenge. Well, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next podcast, and we hope you join us there.
God bless.
Take care.